Welcome back to the, well, not first, but the first so-called episode of the First Class Leathercraft podcast with me, Joseph. Now, don't mind the screech of the chair, but it has been since October 2022, since my last podcast episode went up. So, firstly, I do apologize for the lack of updating of the podcast, but I've decided to start filming some podcast episodes. Hopefully, we'll see how they go. I don't want to promise with how many podcast episodes there will be, but this is a first step. So, welcome to the podcast. As you can see, the name has changed from Joseph M. Leather to First Class Leathercraft. Now, this podcast episode is going to be on my story in Leathercraft, and you can listen to this podcast either through a podcast app, or you can watch this podcast on YouTube, and that's at First Class Leathercraft. And if you do watch it on YouTube, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and also feel free to give me any feedback if you think I need some, because I do enjoy getting your messages actually, because when it comes to a podcast and going through these different podcast apps, you don't really get to see the feedback of listeners. So it's great when people message me and let me know that they enjoy the podcast, etc. So that's the introduction down pat. The structure of this podcast episode is going to be my story in Leathercraft. Now, as you probably know, if you've been listening to the podcast for some time now, that I usually would interview people. And I guess there was some reasons for that. First reason is that's sort of how the podcast began. But the second reason was I didn't really feel like I had a lot to give to the Leathercraft community, as when I first started the podcast, I wasn't very knowledgeable in Leathercraft. So I was pretty much the most unqualified person to make a Leathercraft podcast. So that's the first thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through my journey in Leathercraft, and it pretty much dates back to 2018 was when I got into Leathercraft. I came across it very unexpectedly. I had no prior interest in Leathercraft, no interest in leather bags, all that sort of stuff, zero interest. And how I came across Leathercraft was on YouTube. So I came across the video of the making of a Lloyd coat wallet, and that was how I got into Leathercraft. That video inspired me to take on Leathercraft. Very, when I think back to it, it's very odd because, like I said before, there was no prior experience, no want or need to get into Leathercraft. I know some people that I have spoken to on the podcast, they might have wanted a bag, so then that was their inspiration to get into Leathercraft. Whereas for me, I had no interest, that didn't draw me to Leathercraft. It was pretty much that video. If you have seen that video, making of a Lloyd coat wallet, you can see the craftsmanship that is done into that wallet. So the pricking irons, the stitching, the skiving, all that was just the attention to detail in every aspect of the item was what got me into Leathercraft, and that's what inspired me to get into Leathercraft pretty much. And I can count how many times I actually watched that video, and I did actually get to talk to the guy behind that video, which was Charlie, in episode 6 of the podcast series. So if you want to see that video, you're more than welcome to. That podcast episode, you're more than welcome to. So that's pretty much how I got into Leathercraft. So from there, I after that video was done, I remember watching a video on the different tools of Leathercraft, and I think I was actually very excited to begin learning Leathercraft. So I saw this video, and it was about the basic tools of Leathercraft, and I sort of skipped quite through it, just sort of looked at the different types of tools, and that was sort of how in that video I was too apprehensive to sit through the whole thing because I was too excited, and I just sort of took a look at the tools. Okay, I need tools that look like this, and then that was it. And then the Leathercraft store that the first Leathercraft store that I walked into, I remember saying to the guy, I can't remember, it was like something along, like, that I wanted to get into Leathercraft, and he pretty much just said to me, well, what do you want to make? And I didn't know what I wanted to make. Like, I was so excited just to get into Leathercraft, I didn't know what I wanted to make. So I remember walking around the shop and picking up a stitch and chisel, picked up an edge creaser, I picked up an edge beveler, it was a number 3 edge beveler, wide space stitch and chisel, thick thread, some snaps, I think like a setter, some double cap rivets, and yeah, that was pretty much what I used. And also I got some like edge knot sort of thing. It was like an edge, it wasn't like an edge paint, but it wasn't like an edge stain. It was kind of like that edge knot sort of stuff. Got some dye, and also I got a strip of natural vegetable tan leather, just like a little strip. I think it was like $15 or something like that. The first project I made was like a little snap keyring, and I remember I was so excited when I'd finished it. And well, obviously it was terrible. The cap, the snaps weren't the right size. I don't think the rivet was the double cap rivet was the right size. It was just a mess, but I was so happy I did it, and I dyed the leather as well. And yeah, that was my first project. And then I redid it again. On one of them, I did like a little edge creaser on them with the adjustable edge creaser that I got, and that was the projects that I started off with. It wasn't until I remember I learned dyeing and all that sort of stuff from Chuck Dorset at Weaver Leather Supply. So I was watching the videos on how to dye the leather, and he recommended to have like a pool, or like to have the dye in a contain like a plastic container, and then just feed the leather through, because that would get a consistent dye as opposed to just like using a wool dauber or whatever. So yeah, I learned from a lot of the videos that Weaver Leather Supply did, and all that sort of stuff. So it was a very fun experience to start off with. If I actually remember the first little things that I made, there was no key ring attached to it. So I think I have them down there. If you do sign up to my newsletter, the first newsletter that I did, I actually spoke about my early projects, so there'll be pictures of them there. But yeah, I remember there was no key ring attached. There was no like key ring circle attached to it. So yeah, I remember that. After that, there was another Leathercraft shop, and the guy in there, I was actually quite struggling with the different things. Like I was kind of struggling with, the tools that I had and all that sort of stuff. So at this Leathercraft shop, this guy, he said, right, bring all your stuff in and I'll help you out. So I brought all the stuff that I had in, and he said, yep, you need this tool, keep this tool, and then he sorted me out with a set of tools, and he was kind enough, I think he gave me a bit of a discount for them, so that experience just like helped me a lot. So and then I got some kangaroo scrap leather. So probably a lot of you haven't used kangaroo. I know a lot of my listeners are in the United States. So kangaroo would be classed as an exotic, but over here in Australia, it's quite easy to find. It's yeah, they're pests. There's actually, I should probably do another video on kangaroo specifically, because it is actually a very interesting leather. But I'll try and stay on topic. But yeah, so the first wallet I made was out of black scrap kangaroo leather, and I remember it took me hours to hand stitch it. Thick thread, of course, like that's what we all start off with, like a millimeter thick thread. Um, yeah, that was, if you hear the squeak of the chair, don't mind. It's just the chair that I'm on. But yeah, thick thread. We all start off with that in Leathercraft. Obviously, and yeah, hand stitched it together, and watch videos on YouTube on how to hand stitch. And yeah, I remember being so happy after I completed that first wallet. And I think we all are. I think with all our first projects we made, whether that's key rings or wallets or whatever, it's such a joyous experience, I think. And we only have that experience once as leather craftsmen, because after that you start to judge all your work. I should have done better on this. Should have used a smaller edge beveler. I should have used thinner thread. I should use different pricking irons. Like after we get over that first sort of bump of, we can actually put a project together. It's after that we refine our work and we want to do our best in our leather projects and for customers and family, friends. And then we get picky on the leather we want. We want vegetable tan leather or chrome tan leather or specific leather from Italy or America or Germany or France, blah blah blah. So then we get really picky. So if you are new to Leathercraft, enjoy that first stage of making something, and it's terrible, but because you made it, it's your first time making it, and it's something that whatever hobby it is, whether it's woodwork or leathercraft, I think the first thing you make, it's remarkable and it's a good feeling. So that's sort of how I got into leatherwork, and pretty much after that wallet, I wanted to perfect that wallet. So I just kept on redoing it, and I actually have a box down there of all the different wallets in that one design. Yeah. So that's sort of how it came out of that. And then I think when you start leatherwork, there's a particular style that you like, and I've sort of narrowed it down to 4 different styles in leatherwork, and that would be fine leather goods, which is more of like the European tradition, and you sort of see that in Asia as well. Which is kind of inspired by, I would say, European leather goods. Then I'd say Western leather goods, which is like very heavily entrenched in American, like states like Texas, Colorado, Wyoming, very like the tooling, carving, wet molding. I'd say that's very Western leather goods. Then you have the more rustic leather goods, which is like thick thread, the lower SPIs, like the lower SPI stitching chisels of like 5 space stitching chisel, which is the more rustic leather goods. And then you have the more like social media leather goods, which was, I guess, a lot of us, we learned from social media, or we got inspired by social media. And I could probably make a separate podcast on these 4 different styles, but I would say the social media leather goods is kind of like a fine leather goods, sort of. When I say fine leather goods, this is probably, the smaller spaces, stitches per inch, and making sure like every aspect of the design, of the wallet, of the notebook cover, etc. is just perfect. And I think that's sort of how a lot of us learn. Like I know for me personally, when I saw that video, making of a Lloyd coat wallet, what I really enjoyed about it was Charlie, the man who made that wallet, the attention to detail in every aspect of that wallet. Like it wasn't just everything was, from the leather selection, the thread, the spaces, the stitches per inch of the pricking iron, the hand stitching, the finishing of the edges, like everything was just had full attention, 100%, attention to detail, and that's what sort of inspired me. And I think that social media leather goods takes has that element, has a, when you make leather goods and you sort of see it on social media by a lot of the new people in leathercraft, like myself and others. We want to have every aspect of that product to be done well. So the leather selection, the edges, the stitches, the stitches per inch, the thread size, etc. So if you're not understanding what I'm saying, probably don't worry about it, because this is another segue. For the time being, we'll just focus on my journey. So yeah, from there, 2018. Actually, when I rewind back to 2018, that was actually, I didn't have a very glorious leathercraft time. It was actually a lot of learning and, in the trenches, just learning and learning and learning and learning. Like, I was dyeing leather to start off with, and then I was using the alcohol dye, and then I realized it was water-based dye, so then I switched to the water-based dye. And the problem with the water-based dye I found was, because there was so much water content, it would stiffen up the leather. So for example, I made a passport cover, and I remember I used water-based dye, and because the dye wouldn't really soak into the leather very well, so I'd have all these circular marks, and the vegetable tan leather was so stiff and firm after that. So then after that experience, I was like, oh, I'd like to learn how to dye leather myself. So I'll make my own dye. So I looked up on the internet how to make a natural dye. And I made a blueberry dye. So I got a bunch of blueberries, stuck them in a pot, boiled it for like hours and hours on end. And then I think I might have got rid of all the blueberries, so I got just the liquid left, and I tried to use that to dye leather, and it wasn't very thick at all, because obviously it was, but I think that obviously the water had changed colours, because of the whole idea was to boil the blueberries and then get the colour out of them and then use that for dye. Did that, terrible job. Like, you'd think like a nice blue, but it was kind of like a watery blue. So that's what I learned. I learned, dyeing leather. And then, the idea was just to scrap dyeing. Don't worry about it. Just buy pre-dyed leather. And that's what I did. So I, the leather shop that I got the most of the leather from in the beginning stages was mainly kangaroo and English bridal leather. So that was Thomas Ware and Sons English bridal leather. Loved that leather. So mainly the kangaroo leather to start off with, and then when I started to get into belts, that's when I used the English bridal leather. So it was a good selection to start off with. So in terms of Butter Pueblo, I had no idea that stuff existed until I made the podcast series. And that is another discussion that we can probably get into another time. Because I do want to keep this video around about, podcast audio, whether you're on YouTube or a podcast app, but I want to try and keep this around about 30 minutes, give or take. But yeah, so that's 2018. Yeah, I remember that was a year of like learning, making so many mistakes, like constantly over and over and over and over again. Like, it amazes me when I see a lot of new leather crafters nowadays. I know back in my day, in 2018, it's just a lot more. When I see leather crafters nowadays, like they're beginners and they're just like, oh yeah, and they make a beautiful wallet, and it's like, whoa, like, it was a struggle for me back then, but I guess the information now is just so much more available. There was stuff out in 2018, but I think now there's just a lot more easier access for tutorials, patterns, leather, all that. But on one of the other podcasts, I spoke to, I think it was Nabil from Orange Leather Goods, Leatherworks. We spoke about how difficult it was to get tiger thread. So I remember when in 2018, tiger thread, right? Yeah, to get tiger thread was like this mysterious, amazing thread that like you had to know someone to get a hold of. But now it's like, so easily available. Same with that filet choix thread. I like that. Quite like that thread. That was hard to find as well. I remember that, but now it's quite easily available. But anyway, besides the point. The point is, 2018 for me, my introduction to leatherwork was pretty much trial and error. At one point, I tried to make my own glue. I used, made it out of pearl glue. So that's like these little pearls. I made my own glue. Didn't work very well. I wouldn't recommend it. Made my own conditioner. Made my own conditioner. Actually, yeah, it's over there still. I've hardly ever used it. But what did I use for that? I think I used... I saw on a forum, actually. It was beeswax, beef tallow, and... There was 2 tallows and beeswax. Boil all together, and you can make a conditioner. So I have that conditioner there. But, yeah, that was the conditioner I made. So, yeah, my introduction phase in Leathercraft was interesting, to say the least, actually. So, what else? I've got some notes here. I was actually going to discuss tips and advice for people in Leathercraft, but will I be able to do that in 4 minutes' time? What did I learn? Actually, I'll go back to the other one. What did I learn in Leathercraft? What have I learned? Actually, what I'll do is I'm going to give some tips and advice. Because again, I could just talk for hours on end, if you let me. So, but I want to try and restrict these podcasts to a certain amount of time. So then, if we need to pick up, we can pick up in the next episodes. Because otherwise, I'll talk for hours on end, and then we'll have nothing to talk about in the next episode. So, tips and advice. So if you're a new leathercrafter, my tip would be a bunch of things actually. Number one is take it slow, right? So when I get into a hobby, and this was pretty much for me when I got into leatherwork, because hobbies, you can sort of jump around from one hobby to the next, to the next, to the next. And because leathercraft can actually be quite expensive hobby. So, you get a sewing machine, you get filet choix thread over there, in there, you get tiger thread, you get needles thread. Well, needles aren't really that expensive. But yeah, threads can be expensive, tools can be expensive, Palo Santo edge bevelers and pricking irons, and, there's so many things that can be expensive in leathercraft. So my recommendation is start small. So give yourself a time frame that you'll know whether you like leathercraft or not. Because you might start it and then you might do it and then realize, I'm not interested. And then you've bought all these tools and then you have to try and get rid of them. So that's what I did pretty much. I started off small and worked my way up, to see if I would actually really like leathercraft. And then over time you can start to build up, etc. The next thing is obviously things are expensive. High quality vegetable tan leather is expensive. High quality chrome tan's a bit more cheaper, and maybe combination tan's probably a bit more cheaper as well. But if you buy high quality leather, regardless of vegetable chrome combination tan, and you make a mistake, you use it all for, you make a huge mistake, then you've just wasted all that money. Well, technically, obviously you've wasted it per se, but you've also learned some lessons, but it's a painful lesson to learn, an expensive lesson to learn. I remember buying some combination tan leather to make prototypes for handbags. Now that was a terrible decision, because prototyping, you're not going to be making the best bags when you're prototyping. You're going to be making you're going to make many mistakes, And I pretty much went through that leather, made a bag for it, but then I ended up taking the bag apart to use that leather for something else. So, and that's where split leather can come into play. So like split leather, bonded leather that you can use to prototype. So, yeah, and these are like discussions that we can talk about another time. That's what I was meant to say. So learn the foundational skills in leathercraft. So even if you use like a scrap leather to start off with, use that to learn the stitching methods, learn like the foundations, like just try and get your projects right in like your stitching, your edge beveling, your burnishing, and depending on the scrap leather, if it's vegetable tan or chrome tan or combination tan, it will vary if you can burnish it. So vegetable tan leather is better to burnish. You can't burnish chrome tan. I have heard there's some combination tan leathers that you technically could burnish, but they're exceptions, not the rule. Same with vegetable tan leather, there are exceptions. Goat leather isn't the best to burnish. It can be done, but it's not really the best. So learn the foundational skills first, and then worry about high quality leather, etc. You'll make tons of mistakes. You'll make from tools. You'll make so many mistakes. But if you learn well, I'm actually in the process of a bit of a behind the scenes. I'm in the process of making a course. I'm not going to reveal too much here. That will help new leather crafters, existing leather crafters, etc. But I'm going to keep that on the down low because there is a lot to work on. So I'm very much behind on that. Yeah. So that's pretty much. Again, I've the amount of things I got written down here. But I do want to try and keep these podcasts in a sufficient time frame. It'll be easier to edit as well, and then get these podcasts out. So if I try and keep the podcast in a reasonable time frame, it will allow for me to edit them and then get them out. And then if you have any questions, you can also just get in contact with me, and I'll help you out. And I can also address any questions that you feel like I need to address in other podcast episodes. But that's another thing. If you're on YouTube, I don't know how the other podcast apps work, but if you're on YouTube, like, subscribe, feel free to leave a comment, a nice comment, hopefully, or an appropriate comment. But if you're on any other podcast apps, I don't know how they work with liking and following and all that sort of stuff, but feel free to keep up to date, because I plan on making some new podcast episodes. And if you have any suggestions, feel free to get in contact with me. If you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me as well. I do have some patterns available on my website, First Class Leathercraft. Feel free to download those patterns and use them. And that's it for this podcast episode. Hopefully, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please let me know. And be sure to enjoy your leather crafting.